Welcome back. I'm Juliette Morris. Now, mummies are generally found in places like Egypt or in museums. So how come one turned up in the cupboard of a boarding house in a Welsh seaside town? The small town of Rhyl on the North Wales coast was once a thriving holiday resort. But by the turn of the century, it had begun to decline, and today has the air of being decidedly down on its luck. But for a brief period in the 1960s, it became famous across the world when a bizarre secret that continues to fascinate and revolt came to light. Raymond Vaughan was a young PC in the area at the time.
The case was the most unusual case anybody, including the pathologist or the police, had ever encountered.
The story's set in this neat and pretty ordinary row of terraced houses just behind the railway station, West Kinmel Street. The scene of the crime is number 35. From the outside, there's nothing to distinguish it from any of the other three-bedroomed homes that surround it. But its unremarkable appearance masks an extraordinary past. For in the spring of 1960, a mummified body was found here. Tracy Jones is the current owner of the house and lives here with her two daughters, Callie and Narelle.
We bought the house 2 years ago, and my husband had said he thought it was a house with a mummy in the cupboard. And I was like, what mummy in the cupboard? Because obviously I'd never heard this story before. Anyway, he said that he did, or it's local stories, that a woman was found mummified in a cupboard. And he knew it was in Kinmel Street, but didn't actually know what number in Kinmel Street. So this is when I actually went to the library and got the full story of the mummy in the cupboard. Before that, I knew nothing at all about it. When I'd gone to the library and actually found the story, I was quite shocked to realise it was the house that I'd bought. I didn't believe it would be this house.
Gradually, Tracy uncovered the story behind the strange death. She found out that from the 1940s onwards, her home was run as a boarding house by a lady called Sarah Jane Harvey. In 1960, she went into hospital, and her son decided to decorate. What was planned as a surprise for his mother quickly became an unpleasant surprise for him. He opened a cupboard on the landing that had been kept locked throughout his childhood, and discovered the mummified body of an old lady.
As far as I'm concerned, this is where the cupboard was, where the lady was actually found in some past year. The cupboard wasn't here when I bought the house, so I presume they must have knocked it down after they found her.
But who was she, and how did she get there? PC Raymond Vaughan saw the body in the mortuary, but it gave him no clues.
I attended many post-mortems, but I'd never seen a body like this before. It looked to me like two slabs of concrete. There were no recognizable human features. There were no ears, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. There were no clothes on the body, and there were no hair on the body. It was the first mummified body I'd ever seen, and I shall remember it as long as I shall live.
The body's identity was a mystery. The only person who might have the answer was the boarding house owner, Sarah Jane Harvey. Suspicion inevitably fell on her. Her explanation was that the dead woman was an elderly lady called Mrs. Knight, who'd moved into the house in 1940. She wasn't well, and according to Mrs. Harvey, died suddenly one night. Not knowing what to do, she dragged the body along the corridor and put it in the cupboard, where it stayed for 20 years.
Foul play was suspected from the outset. The only thing that could give a positive direction, way in that direction, would be a thorough post-mortem, but it was quite impossible to carry that out. But Dr. Gerald Evans was of the opinion that something had been tightened around the neck on the torso, causing the death of the person. consequently, the woman who was looking after this dead person in Rhyl was subsequently charged with murder.
The lack of conclusive evidence meant that Mrs. Harvey was found not guilty. She was, however, convicted of another crime, fraud, because for the 20 years that Mrs. Knight had been dead, Mrs. Harvey had been collecting her maintenance money.
I think the odd thing about this case was that the lady of the boarding house concealed the body in the cupboard for over 20 years solely for the purpose of drawing the maintenance due to the deceased, which amounted to a little over £2 a week, which was a lot of money in those days. She could have lived reasonably well on £2 a week in 1940. By the time the body was found in 1960, she would have accumulated somewhere in the region of £2,000, which would have been a windfall to many people.
Mrs. Harvey was sentenced to 15 months imprisonment for fraud. The crime made Rhyl a household name. People were fascinated by how the mummification could have occurred. It was a natural process. The doors of the cupboard allowed a free access of air, which gradually dried out the body.
I think the cupboard would have stopped here, but maybe it did actually go along, sort of perhaps to the top of the door there, and this is where the cooler air was coming through to actually mummify the body. But if you just look there, you would think it actually ended there, unless there was perhaps a vent at the top of it that's, allowed the air to come in and out and obviously mummifying her. I think it's very unbelievable that somebody was actually mummified, because you think would have just gone to bones and wilted away in time, not actually mummified. But it's not, it was a little bit weird, a little bit scary to think of it.
When the horror story hit the headlines, sightseers flocked to the town.
At the time, when they actually found the mummified body, I suppose it made the house famous. And they used to bring day trips back and forth, people to say, this is the house with the mummified body in. But it's, I wouldn't want to go and see outside of a house where there's been a body mummified. But at the time, it was quite a big story, quite historical.
These days, Ryl's most notorious death is largely forgotten. But for Tracy Jones and her family at 35 West Kinmel Street, Mrs. Knight hasn't quite been laid to rest.
Well, at the moment, I'm standing in the cupboard where she would have been. And it's very strange, eerie feeling. Feel kind of cold, and to think this is where somebody was kept for 20 years, just left to rot away. So it feels really strange, really weird. I've lived here for 2 months. When I originally bought it, my brother moved in and his wife and rented for a year. Then my younger brother moved in after that and he rented for a year. My older brother moved out as far as I'm aware of because he found out about the mummy in the cupboard and he was scared.
My uncle actually told me that one night when he went to the toilet, he saw her and he did run back to his girlfriend and he was very white in the face. I didn't really believe the story at first. I thought he was just trying to scare me, but we have heard other noises in between the time. This is my mum and my sister's room. It was actually my uncle's and my auntie's. They moved out, they said it was too spooky. When he first moved in here, he was decorating this room and this wall. He put the scissors on top of the ladder when he turned away to put a piece of wallpaper up and the scissors started floating towards him. You sometimes hear her coming along the landing. She's quite heavy-footed. Things go missing around the house, and she sometimes likes playing with your hairdryer and electrical goods. I always thought if you die naturally, then you automatically don't become a ghost. But if you die, or if you're murdered, I think then they would come back to haunt you.